Scratch any fan of classic sci-fi and you'll find a lover of bad movies. Whether it's Santa Claus Conquers the Martians, The Room, Frankenhooker, or of course the cream of the crop Plan 9 from outer space.
You see? You're stupid minds! Stupid!
I'll get to it one of these days. Most of us geeks unironically adore a good, terrible movie. I can offer no meaningful sociological explanation for this phenomenon, but I like to think it is an evolutionary response to creative crisis. In order to biologically reinforce the idea that we must create, even if what we create is garbage, we are capable of finding worthiness in spectacularly unlikely places, much to the consternation of critics. Movies like these have brought more joy to audiences than they ever could have had they been quote-unquote well made. However, I am not making this video to make fun of a bad movie. Instead, I want to celebrate a bad movie, and point out that just because something is a good example of bad filmmaking, that doesn't make it worthless, even from an artistic or academic point of view. So, with that in mind, let's talk about a guy in a gorilla suit with a papier-mâché diving helmet on his head.
I cannot, yet I must. How do you calculate that?
Nearly the entire human race has been obliterated by Roman and his calcinator death ray, save a professor and his family who are immune to its effects. Roman is tasked with tracking down these paltry last remnants of earthbound civilization and destroying them, with his bare hands if need be. However, he finds himself unable to kill the professor's beautiful daughter, and as the family closes in to rescue her from his mechanical clutches, he must choose to either do his deadly duty or be destroyed by the great guidance who commands him.
At the start of the 1950s, science fiction cinema was in the midst of its biggest boom in history, and in order to coax even more audiences into theaters, 3D pictures were rising in popularity. 1953 saw the release of landmark 3D films like It Came from Outer Space, Hondo, House of Wax, Dial M for Murder, Kiss Me Kate, and Creature from the Black Lagoon, proving that practically any genre could ride the three-dimensional gimmick to box office success. Enter Al Zimbalist, a writer and publicist who'd been working in the industry for over 2 decades and who was just starting out as a film producer. He owned a company called True Stereo, and he wanted to sell a more inexpensive 3D process to the big studios, so he got together with the writer Phil Tucker to produce Robot Monster. Now, a disclaimer, I've done a ton of research for this video, but despite my best efforts, I can't actually tell you whose idea Robot Monster, which had a working title of Monsters from the Moon, actually was, whether it was dreamed up by Zimbalist, Tucker, or the scriptwriter Wyatt Ordung. My best guess is that the script came first, originally written by Ordung, and was bought by Tucker to serve as his directorial debut, and then Tucker probably sought out the financial help of Zimbalist, who introduced the 3D gimmick. During the course of production, Tucker, as director, heavily reworked and rewrote the script, and after the film released, Ordung essentially disowned it, claiming it wasn't what he'd written and that due to a shady contract he was never paid for it. Due to the movie's reception, which I'll discuss later, it seems nobody wanted to take credit for conceiving of Robot Monster. There's a similar murkiness about whether or not Zimbalist and his True Stereo company actually owned any 3D camera rigs at this point, and there is a great debate about what rig was used to make the movie. I'm not going to get deep into the weeds here, but the best, albeit circumstantial, evidence suggests Zimbalist borrowed a specific rig that was in use at the time, which might help explain the incredibly tight filming window between 4 and 10 days, which is another point of contention I'll save for later. The Professor is played by John Mylung, born Adolf Heinrich Muntz, a Jewish emigre from Austria who had left behind a successful acting career. He got by in Hollywood with small roles here and there, but he never reached star status and was relatively inexpensive. The professor's wife, meanwhile, is played by Selina Royle, a far more well-known acting talent who had appeared in The Fighting Sullivans and Joan of Arc, in addition to having a storied career in radio. However, she too was inexpensive, due to being blacklisted because she refused to appear before the House Un-American Activities Commission after her name appeared in the infamous Red Channel's report. The young male hero of the movie, Roy, is played by George Nader, who was at the time a bit player with only a handful of credits to his name. Nader was the only actor on the film who managed to parlay his performance into future success, and he would go on to be a heartthrob leading man, despite the fact that he was gay. His love interest in Robot Monster, the professor's daughter Alice, is played by Claudia Barrett, who had had a few notable roles alongside the likes of James Cagney and Humphrey Bogart, and who took the part against the advice of her agent, even though he was the one who sent her to the audition in the first place. While Robot Monster didn't help her career, it certainly didn't hurt it either, and she continued to find steady work in film and television for decades afterward. Later in life, she would embrace Robot Monster's cult status and would pop up occasionally on the sci-fi convention circuit to talk about the movie or, in one memorable case, to talk over it after the sound cut out and she decided to do an impromptu audio commentary. The other two kids, Johnny and Carla, are played by child actors Gregory Moffat and Pamela Paulson, neither of which would really pursue acting into adulthood. But the real star of the film is Roman, the titular robot monster, along with the nearly identical Great Guidance, whose only visual differences are variations in the helmet. Both are voiced by radio star John Brown. Though he had managed to break into film with roles in big movies like Strangers on a Train and The Day the Earth Stood Still, he was, like Selina Royle, blacklisted by the Red Channel's report, which is how Tucker and Zimbalist were able to afford him. Physically, though, Roman is played by George Barrows, who had actually constructed his own ape suit in order to perform as one in multiple films and television shows. In those days, the price of renting a gorilla costume were pretty high, and for productions on a budget, it was good to have a few actors on hand who not only had experience working in such a costume, but who could supply it themselves. Barrows wasn't the only or even the first actor to have this idea, but he is one of the more well-known ones, no doubt in large part due to his work on Robot Monster. The story goes that Zimbalist was looking into robot costumes, but couldn't find one that wasn't going to double or even triple the film's small budget, so he called up Barrows, who he knew personally, and thus the robots became mostly ape, something that is never addressed in the film. The only robot parts are the papier-mâché helmets with a TV antennae attached, which weren't exactly breaking the bank to produce, and were based on designs from Flight to Mars. The only other actor appearing in the film is Trustin Howard, working under the pseudonym Slick Slavin, who performs the opening one-reel sketch Stardust in Your Eyes. He got the role in part because he was able to come up with his own song, which meant the producers didn't need to pay for licensing. His segment of the film was lost for years and almost completely forgotten about, but it was discovered by 3D archivist Bob Furmanek, the same man who found the original 3D prints of Robot Monster, and when Howard was finally found in the mid-2000s, the now elderly man was genuinely surprised to learn that the short had survived or that anybody even cared about it. This led to a minor resurgence in the character of Slick Slavin, who even performed at Robot Monster screenings. The movie was filmed in mid to late March of 1953, almost entirely at the Bronson Caves in Griffith Park, with the family's residence consisting of a half-demolished housing complex that was about to be replaced by Dodger Stadium. As I mentioned earlier, there is some debate about how long the shoot lasted, with the conventional narrative reporting it only went for 4 days. However, it is far more likely that the shoot lasted at least a few days longer than that, with reports from surviving cast and crew over the years offering conflicting information on this point. At the very least, we do know that there was additional shooting involving George Nader and Claudia Barrett that took place after the 4-day stretch in which the film was allegedly shot. The special effects were put together primarily by Jack Rabin of Complete Film Enterprises, which specialized in low-budget pictures. Rabin had previously worked on Rocket Ship XM, some footage of which shows up in Robot Monster. More stock footage was pulled from other films like Flight to Mars and 1 Million BC. As for the 3D process, done by Zimbalist's company, it wasn't what you're probably imagining. The short version is it didn't use these things. It used a polarized 3D process, more akin to what we use today. During the brief sequences showing scenes of destruction, different scenes were projected to each eye, leading to a disorienting but not unprecedented double vision effect. All in all, the 3D cinematography is actually impressive, with even the most scathing reviews of the time period admitting that it was one of the best uses of 3D during a time when 3D was saturating the market. If you haven't seen it in 3D, you'd be surprised what a difference it makes. Zimbalist managed to secure a deal with Nathan Bubbles Fisher, who paid to have his automatic billion bubble machine featured in the film, along with the handheld bubble toy seen at the start. Sales of Fisher's products, particularly the handheld toy, skyrocketed because of Robot Monster. As for the music, it was put together by a 30-year-old Elmer Bernstein. Elmer's career was off to a rocky start, seeing as how he had also been blacklisted. Nevertheless, his music for Robot Monster garnered positive attention, leading to his breaking through with scores for films like The Ten Commandments, The Great Escape, True Grit, and of course, Ghostbusters. Robot Monster released in the late summer of 1953 to nearly universal derision from critics, but it still managed to be a box office hit, earning roughly $1 million against its paltry $16,000 budget. It played in both 2D and 3D, and it was the first feature-length 3D film not to charge extra for the added dimension, helping its popularity with audiences. It was reissued a couple of years later under a new title, Monster from Mars, before becoming a fixture on television well into the 1970s. It saw a revival in the early 1980s when MTV produced and ran a Halloween special showing of the film, broadcast in 3D, that had a few bonus skits tacked on, featuring the great Bob Burns as Roman. The 3D was shoddy, using a converted blue and red anaglyphic process rather than the original film's polarized one, and the broadcast led to headaches both technical and literal. But it nevertheless turned Robot Monster into a bona fide cult classic, with its various home video releases earning millions and the film frequently turning up at fan conventions. It has found itself in the clutches of Mystery Science Theater 3000 and Riff Tracks, and Roman has cameoed multiple times in both television and film. He even pops up with amusing regularity here on YouTube. As for me, I believe Robot Monster is a work of sheer genius. No, I'm not kidding. It's clearly a movie made on a microscopic budget with a lot of the talent behind the scenes just winging it in real time. However, whether by accident or by design, that talent managed to produce a film that speaks to us on a different level than your average, more professionally made film. To explain what I mean, let's talk about the ending. The movie ends on the twist reveal that the whole thing was just an imaginative boy's dream after taking a bad fall and losing consciousness, a story point that was allegedly added late into production. Normally, this would be a ludicrous and lazy plot twist, but here, it gives new meaning to practically everything, from the inexplicable Roman appearance and bubble machine, to the simplistic narrative and ridiculous yet earnest dialogue. Granted, it still doesn't explain why the family takes an outdoor nap in the middle of the day, but whatever. So I'm just gonna come right out and say how I interpret the movie. This is a young boy's subconscious way of dealing with the loss of his father. His father's recent passing is mentioned early on before the dream sequence even begins, and for a young boy like Johnny, I don't see much difference between losing a parent and surviving an apocalypse. He thus conjures a reality where the professor is his new father, but it isn't enough to fix a world that has been broken. Roman and the Great Guidance represent death itself, coming for him and all his loved ones, and in the end, spoiler alert, death wins, which represents Johnny having to face the cruel cost of mortality. You see, despite its innocent veneer, this is an incredibly dark story about the end of all things, about the inevitable death that awaits each and every one of us and the losses we'll experience along the way. While it wasn't intended as a comedy, the fact that people can laugh at Robot Monster for its immaturity as a film
The boy is impertinent.
is a kind of psychic release, a way of making fun of the Grim Reaper by putting him in an ape suit and a stupid helmet. So yes, laugh at it. Delight in its corny absurdity and heartfelt lack of sophistication. But don't underestimate it, because Robot Monster is, certifiably, a sci-fi classic. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. What other bad movies should I cover? Let me know in the comments, and while you're down there, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Thank you for watching, and until next time when we'll see what a lunar bovine looks like, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love. As long as you're not hurting anybody.
If I only had a decent assistant who could take orders instead of trying to be the boss.
I'm bossy. You're so bossy you ought to be milked before you come home at night.